Good evening, I'm Christie Max Williams, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the concluding program of this, the 20th anniversary year of the Arts Café Mystic. For those of you new to the Arts Café, our mission is to present the nation's most celebrated poets and writers, along with New England's finest musicians, in programs that lift your spirit while deepening your mind. And if we have a little fun along the way, so much the better. 20 years. It's a concept, isn't it? Of course, chronologically speaking, 20 years is an infinitesimal span of time, which arbitrarily signifies nothing more than 20 orbits of a small planet around an ordinary star. Even on our fair planet, 20 years is but the minutest moment in geological history. And even in recorded human history, 20 years is a relatively significant duration. Think of such venerable manifestations of the human spirit as the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church, saltine crackers. On the other hand, the Arts Café is longer lived than a lot of marriages you and I have been acquainted with. So, in the same bemused survivor spirit in which wedding anniversaries are celebrated, we would like you to join us in some toasting. It's a nice way to start the show, don't you think? Yeah, we'll find lots to toast perhaps in the future. Oddly enough, it seems to me, art and poetry don't much go together as complementary talents. Think about it. How many serious artists can you think of who wrote real poetry? And vice versa. Michelangelo is the obvious exception, having written some of the great sonnets in his language. D.H. Lawrence, who was a great poet, novelist, and essayist, also painted some wonderful watercolors. Bob Dylan, who some think of as an important poet, also paints. Badly, really. Take it from me, I've seen the work. But you see what I'm driving at. However, Melissa Croghan, who is our opening voice tonight, confounds my point. An award-winning and highly regarded artist, she is also the author of a well-reviewed novel, and damned if she hasn't published a charming book of poems called Cliff Walk, Poems and Paintings of Mackinac and Beyond. Because you paid attention in your geography class, you will recall that Mackinac Island is a small chunk of land situated on Lake Huron, right between the upper and lower peninsula of Michigan. Is it peninsulae of Michigan? Indeed, there is a Fort Mackinac there that factored in the Revolution and the War of 1812, that being a very strategic strait. As depicted in Melissa Croghan's lyrical and painterly poems, Mackinac Island is a lovely and provocative place. But you will hear and see for yourself, because in an evening that will establish more than one precedent for the Arts Café, Ms. Croghan will use some of her paintings to enlighten some of her poems, and vice versa. So won't you please join me in welcoming Melissa Croghan.
Very kind words, Christie. I'm glad to be here and especially honored to be part of this glorious 20th anniversary of our Arts Café. As a poet-painter, it sometimes happens that while I'm writing, I find that, or it feels like, the paintbrush is moving subterraneously along. And when I arrive at a stopping place, a draft or two, I have to hightail it to the studio and paint. The reverse is sometimes true. And that's what happened with this first poem. The painting came first. I meant to bring this painting. I left it at home in Simsbury, Connecticut, but it's right here, and it's in the book. You can take a gander later. The title of the painting and the poem is Childhood. A woman who drops by my studio says to me every so often, "That childhood oil painting, it's not sad, but it bothers me." In it, the trees churn, the child's eyebrows are stilts falling, and clearly the kid is engaged in something beyond our ken. I do like it, but it bothers me. Her eyes enlarge as she speaks. Her mouth forms a stern margin. As for me, I can hardly contain my glee. For what is art if it does not make your eyeballs pop? You'll see several paintings, there's one down here, on easels nearby. And this one is an introspective self-portrait, although I guess that's a contradiction of terms. It's an expressionistic self-portrait. And it happens to be the same title as this poem right here. I was thinking about the genre, and it led me to this, the self-portrait. Van Gogh did plenty of them, and Picasso was no slouch himself. Rembrandt was the king, tallying up some 60 mirror images and yet managing to toggle back and forth between other subjects and himself. Monet, Monet, they all did it. But Frida, well, the self-portrait was her game. She was the queen of self-portrait painters with more than 50 images of her comely face and form. But beauty belies your anguish, Frida Kahlo. You painted your heart out, quite literally. See, memory of the heart. And if that sword left nothing but a gaping hole in a canvas or two, you were strong. You picked up your beating muscle so casually left in the corner, in the dirt, and painted it back in. And such a big heart it was, painting Diego many times over, his fine, fat self, lascivious monkeys too, larger than life parrots, these devoted companions framing your face, and not to forget the letter to a dubious lover and love of your looming family, mother, father, and grandparents branched out on the tree of humanity. After the accident, your mother fixed a mirror over your bed and gave you paints and brushes. I think of you today, Frida, for when I was a child, I was sick in bed, once for 7 months, and then again 5 more. I had a parrot then. His name was Pirate, and he used to love to sit on my head, his talons sharp on my scalp, but I couldn't bear to hurt his feelings and tell him to fly away. Once I did, and he fluttered to the bedpost, regarding me with a reproachful eye. Like you, Frida dear, my parrot inspired me, and my mother gave me paper and pencil, told me to draw and to write a story. But my months in bed were nothing like what you went through, and your output was dazzling. There are people who get confused by this. They think self-portrait, the solipsistic artist. But no, truth is, we are our own handiest models. Good for introspection, too. No model fees and no worries to plan the when and where of studio time. Frida knew this. As for me, I have but a handful of self-studies. Frida's advantage? She painted herself in her 20s, 30s, 40s. I painted a few back then, but mostly I've missed the boat on young faces, unless I make things up, go wrinkle-free, every artist's prerogative. Frida knew this. Beautiful robes had she, elaborate garments and decorative detail attending her crippled, tempestuous life, body pierced by a metal rail, body pierced by betrayal. But traveling beyond the paltry self, your wounded stag, your tree of hope keeps strong. Self-portrait with a doll, the child you never had. And finally, in 1950, after 7 operations in 1 year, there were the words you painted, "Viva la vida," anguish and art, pain and paint. Make art make you whole again. Frida knew this. Where is he? Here's a poem about a dear friend of mine. And the setting in the poem is summer, not winter as you see here. But the subject is the same. The life of Poe. My feet find their slippers, and I open the door for Poe, my basset hound, to charge outside, his due diligence of checking every nook and cranny for the interlopers last night, the stealth visitors who lapped at the pond and ferreted out the last scrumptious bit of fall greens. Fox, rabbit, deer, and fisher cat have enjoyed the 4 corners of our yard. Poe, in the parlance of top security bureaus, is my sniffer dog. Nose flaps going 100 miles an hour, bloodshot eyes rimmed in Cleopatra kohl, silken ears drooping to the ground in a purpose meant for drag and pick-up scent, his tail an upward staccato of intense dog happiness. A meditation, a mantra in motion that I do not take for granted, especially since once I almost lost him. He and I were surprised by 3 bear cubs crossing the trail in front of us. Poe tore after them, disappearing into the tall meadow forest, baying his heart out, and I yelling, "Come back!" No sight of him, and his song stopped dead. I could hear milkweeds burst. I could hear stones talk. Then behind me a sound. I whirled, and there my little hound, scuttling out of the wood, chastened, tail between his legs and brow, wrinkled in thought. If he saw the great mother, he never said a word. A partial muse. I do take him to the studio. I paint much better. He's there. It's hard to leave a home that one loves. A few years ago, I had to sell a house that had been in my family for many generations. This was on Mackinac Island in the Great Lakes of Michigan. And the thing is about this, about moving, oh, I forgot to say, I moved to a new place, and it's very nice, but guess what? It's different. So, in order to make the adjustment, I had to write about it. The sweet potato sizzle. Sound like an unlikely dance? Well, it goes like this. In our new place on the island, I revel in the garden. The pinkest cosmos, nice spiky zinnias. And as for the studio where my filberts, brights, and flats direct my hand to the canvas, it couldn't be more sublime. Yet sadly, there is a flaw. There is trouble in Whoville. Across the street is an industrial strength hotel dryer that never gets turned off. I tell this to Tim on the phone. What? He says. Who? I can't hear you over the dryer next door. Busy, busy, that hotel with its machinery that obliterates the foghorn, is bigger than the wind, gives more rattle than the carriages, and is less soulful than the tree frogs. Don't remind me. Hotel guests do need clean sheets. And while I'd like to talk the proprietor into stringing clotheslines from pillar to post, it could be a hard sell. But tonight, my ears brighten. And yes, I hear the birds above the racket. All is not lost. Sharply sweet, this bird song. I hear it larger than the infernal dryer. Thrilling, thrilling, until I realize it is not a bird, not remotely. It is my sweet potato, singing a high-pitched musical hiss that says, do not think dryer, think supper. All is not lost. You have a sweet potato in the oven. Let's see. This actually is a painting or a print of a painting of Mackinac Island, and it's you can see a sign to the dryer with the hotel with the infernal dryer right there. There's a walk-run race. You can kind of stick it up over there because we're sort of in Mackinac for this one. This next poem connects New England to Mackinac Island. We have to go back in time, nearly 200 years, now that I think of it. And it's about Margaret Fuller. When this poem takes place, she had already published her very fine study of equality for women and why it's a good idea, to put it mildly. And she was in the Mackinac region researching Summer on the Lakes, which became the first popular travel book by an American. Traveling alone. Rare for a lady of the 19th century, Margaret Fuller was that passenger from Boston, the lady with the voyageurs in their longboat, oars in the water to Sault Ste. Marie. She was not yet famous, though already Emerson reveled at her intellect, besotted with it, really. They were best friends, and she the editor of their fabled Dial, that transcendental journey that would draw in Thoreau and many more of the palm thinkers. She left all that and traveled alone to the wilderness, wild to go west, young woman, and found herself note-taking late by the fire, her journal fed by the ribald stories of the oarsmen of the old Northwest, and the Indians and the fur traders humming alive on Mackinac. Margaret's journey to Michigan came 7 years before she died at sea, with her new husband an infant in her arms. But there she was in that earlier year in a longboat in risky waters. And this was where she had a revelation. Life, its gorgeous storms, the teary relief at seeing her boon companions once she got back safely to Mackinac. This was good and well, but now she was ruined. She had learned the plain excitement of being on one's own, where fear is undiluted, and freedom, too. One last short poem. This is about the little brown bat, suffering recently from the white nose syndrome. And this bat ranges up and down the East Coast as well as on Mackinac Island. I was thinking about the bat and its plight and looking back to my childhood to write this. But something else, it occurs to me that this poem is about is it's about opposing sides and sorting out all that. And in that one way, I think it does suit as a prelude to Betty's upcoming talk. It's very different. Believe me, it has nothing really, but it's just that little bit. Sensing where things are. We squealed, they squeaked, the little browns of my youth, diving for their dinner on the cliff walk, cleaning up the bugs. And when you think closely on the squeal and the squeak, it is only an L and a K that makes them different. Neighbors in the lineup of the alphabet. Neighbors in the suspects' row of guilty or not. Us and the little brown bat. Us and them. Once, one of them got caught on my shirt when I was flying down the hill on my bike. My shirt tail blew up, and I felt the fuzzy down like a duckling. I felt the little brown and its fear of me. Us and them on this island together, their radar, our foghorns. Safe passage tolling.
Thank you, Melissa. Pirate the Parrot and Poe the Pooch. Didn't T.S. Eliot say, "The naming of cats is a serious matter"? I'm pleased to announce that we have Melissa's Cliff Walk poems and paintings on Mackinac Island for sale tonight. Mine is the affliction of a reader who has never heard that word spoken before. I should add that all sales proceeds, as always, go to the author, or in this case, the author-artist. This is a lovely book. It would look splendid on your bookshelf. This gives me a chance to thank Mystic's own independent bookstore, Bank Square Books, for continuing to partner with the Arts Café. I also want to express our thanks to Mystic Arts Center for welcoming the Arts Café again. So. The sea, have I got that pronunciation right? The sea is the name of a remarkable new duo of singer-songwriters, which we're really excited to share with you. Because you studied your ancient Greek, and because you particularly steeped yourself in the works of Xenophon, and most particularly his masterpiece, Anabasis. You will remember that touching moment in the story when the Greek soldiers, in returning to their coastal homeland after a long inland war, cried out in joy, "The sea, the sea." Joy indeed. But the name adopted by these young musicians is not all that's remarkable about them. Their superb debut album, which they are now touring, has as its title, "Love We Are, We Love," which you, of course, recognized immediately as a palindrome. Seriously. And which is the sort of literary sparkle that informs their song lyrics, which no less than American Songwriter magazine have called smart and intricate. But most remarkable of all is the sound of the sea, the sea. In particular, the close harmonies that stamp their work as original. Huffington Post has described them as two of the loveliest male-female voices you might ever hear. NPR gave them a recent shout-out. My friends, you are about to receive a delightful moment in music. Won't you please join me in welcoming the sea, the sea.
Was thinking about my restless heart. Was thinking about my restless heart. Yeah, I don't know what for. I'm not anxious, I'm not bored. I'm looking for a brand new start. The dream I had, it was the same. I was sitting on that old westbound train. There was a young boy, he was selling snake oil. He said, "Here, take this for the pain." I never was one to believe in a quick fix remedy, oh, but I've got no ace up my sleeve. Took that train to the end of the line, over prairies and through the pines. There was a circus car and temptations at the bar and implications to disregard. I never was one to believe that being wild is the same as being free. Oh, I guess I've been that naive. To our front yard, the magnolia in the front yard. Yes, spring's coming soon and all its buds of bloom, the color of my restless heart. And the flowers in the garden know just how they need to grow. They don't get confused, they don't need no walking shoes to get where they need to go. I never was one to believe that being wild is the same as being free. If I ever had an ace up my sleeve, it was you. Thank you so much. Well, happy anniversary, Arts Cafe. This is wonderful. We're so thrilled to be invited to be a part of this celebration and happy to stumble upon this amazing gem of a place. So. Okay, Bo.
Well, we want to thank Christie for that really wonderful introduction. We don't have any more banter for between our songs. He was way more eloquent than we could be.
I know we're gonna take him on the road and get him to tell the See the Sea story.
Pack up all my care and woe. Here I go singing low. Bye, bye, blackbird. Where somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, and so is she. Bye, bye, blackbird. No one here can love or understand me. Oh, what are luck stories they all hand me. Make my bed and light the light. I'll be home late tonight. Blackbird, bye bye.
Life of 1,000,000 years, so I buried it in the ground, right between the mountains, and watched as it sank down. You were saying something about something on the radio, or was it that you had to go? Oh, I thought it was a radio. You said love was a question, the answer was everything. Did I know what you mean? Think you said everything. Thought it was a radio. Guess it was, you had to go. Other day turned over in its grave and made an awful sound. It rolled on through the valley and shook the earth around. You were saying something about something like a freight train. Could have been the evening rain. Oh, I thought it was a freight train. You said love was a question, the answer was everything. Did I know what you mean? Think you said everything. Thought it was a freight train. Guess it was the evening rain. Like it had before, and I rolled the stone away and pushed it up the mountain, and thought I heard you say something about how you have to let some things go. Could have been the radio. I thought it was a freight train. guess it was just everything. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, as Christie mentioned, we have the album that we just released. It's called Love, We Are, We Love, which I think is now #1 on the charts for the most misread and mispronounced album title of all time. We've gotten every iteration you could ever imagine. And then once we say it's a palindrome, usually that clears it up, believe it or not. Anyhow, we are songwriting nerds, and we really got nerdy with this song. We just had this. There was an adage. We played a show, and somebody told us that one of our songs reminded them of this adage, which is,
We are too soon old and too late smart.
I don't know where it's from, but it did sound.
Apparently, it's an adage attributed to almost every country and culture. I tried to look at it.
So we heard that someone told us that in West Virginia, where we played our show that day, and then we were driving back to upstate New York, where we live right now, and Mira had this idea to write a song that had that idea in it, and for some reason have a palindrome in it. So we came up with these palindromic lines in the song, and see if you can find them, even if you can't.
Or you can just listen. Love, we are young, too old, too soon, too old, too young. Are we love? We are young, too old, too soon, too old, too young. Are we love? We are young, too old, too soon, too old, too young. Are we young? We are young, too old, too soon, too old, too young. Are we young? Are we love? Are we love? Are we? Love, what can be done with what's left behind of your troubled mind? Love, we are young, too old, too soon, too old, too young. Are we love? We are wise, too late to know, too late to wise. Love, as are we. Thank you.
Is there any way we could steal another water? We're the sea, we require liquids.
So we do a whole lot of traveling. We spend most of our time on the road. Thanks. And we've been playing this song. I wrote this song a few years ago. And when I wrote it, it sort of came more from like a relationship point of view, and it's sort of based on the story of two people on a boat in the middle of the ocean, and they're lost, and there's this big storm happening, and they love each other, and the hope is that they as long as they're together, and as long as the boat doesn't sink, they find a place that they're okay being in this situation with this other person. And so the more we've been playing this song around the country the last couple of years and experiencing some really crazy weather events. Like we've had some close calls with some tornadoes and some floods, like some real weather, and even here, I mean, in the Northeast with some winter stuff that has sort of, made us think about it. But anyhow, the beauty of if that can be said, of the aftermath of a lot of these events that we've been around, is the way that community really comes together in those situations. And so we've been singing this song more with that, through that lens of a sort of a community sticking together, as opposed to a relationship thing. It's called Battened Hatches. Sticks and battened hatches, a deck of cards and waterproof matches. We'll sail on through the storm, come what may. Got all we need, no reason to be afraid. When the world's been raining, cats and dogs. When the world's been flooding, dry land is gone, and all we've got left is each other and this boat we're on. Now give a kiss and bat those lashes. I'll check the nuts and find where the flask is. Our clothes
other and this boat we're on.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We've got a couple more for you, and we're looking forward to the rest of the night.
So we're honored to be part of a night with poets and writers. That's something that we don't get to do very often, to share a night like this. So we're very thankful to be here.
Yeah.
We're going to do a song that we didn't write. This is the one that we didn't write that we're going to play, but we feel like we've interpreted it in our own way. So it's ours.
You'll probably recognize it.
We probably didn't need to tell you. Here we go.
So I lit the fire, isn't it good? Norwegian wood. So I lit the fire, isn't it good? Norwegian wood. So I lit the fire, isn't it good? Norwegian wood. I once had a girl, or should I say, she once had me. She showed me her room, isn't it good? Norwegian wood. She asked me to stay and she said I could sit anywhere. I looked around and I noticed there wasn't a chair. I sat on her rug, biding my time, drinking her wine. We talked until 2, and then she said, it's time for bed. She told me she worked in the morning and started to laugh. I told her I didn't and crawled off to sleep in the bath. And when I awoke, I was alone. This bird had flown. So I lit the fire, isn't it good? Norwegian wood. So I lit the fire, isn't it good? Norwegian wood. So I lit the fire, isn't it good? Norwegian wood. So I lit the fire, isn't it good? Norwegian wood.
Thank you. Switch sides for this one.
All right, we're gonna do one more short one here. The quick story behind it. It's based on a murmuration of birds, which is, if you don't know already, the thing that they do, the swarming kind of thing they do when they migrate, where they kind of are in that big cloud of darkness, and then one moves just a little bit, and then they all follow.
Yeah, and this song actually, it's the last song on our album, and it started out as a poem. And we thought that the idea of a murmuration was just a really good metaphor for the way we all sort of exist in the world together, and how sort of even the slightest actions that we do every day, or the bigger ones in our life, can have really far-reaching reverberations. So we like to think of this as a song about being good to each other.
It was the sound, a gentle thunder, 10,000 birds in the front yard all together, all at once, taking wing to lift the silence that one moves, moves. The other, it was the sound, a gentle thunder. It was the sight, edges blurred. You, me, mother, father, friend, lover, stranger, foe, that one moves. The other, it was the sight, edges blurred. It was the thought, taking wing, moves. The other, you, me, it was the sight, it was the sound that one moves all together, a gentle thunder, edges blurred all at once, 10,000
Thank you so much.
The sea, ladies and gentlemen. Chucky Costa, Mira Stanley. Thank you. We have the Sea's debut album, Love We Are, We Love. It's a superb album. Our children were home from college last week, and they said this was cool. And if you buy it, you too could be cool. I know it's an idea. We'll take a few minutes break, and then we'll come back for the mighty Betty Medsger. Thank you. In our 20 years, the Arts Café has presented many of the nation's best poets. It's what we do, and we take seriously our commitment to being your ambassador to great poetry. Indeed, only on rare occasions have we broken with this commitment. Most recently, some of you may remember that we presented the brilliant novelist Wally Lamb, and a while back the gifted memoirist Nick Flynn, and No Wild Horses Will Not Drag for Me, the title of his great memoir, which he read at this podium, and which is another night in Suck City. Wild horses won't get that out of me. These exceptions prove the rule, I suppose, but rules, of course, are made to be broken. In all these years, we have never presented anyone like the distinguished journalist and nonfiction writer Betty Medsger, who is tonight's featured writer, and never anything remotely like her extraordinary new book, The Burglary. In breaking precedent this way, we were moved by the high quality of Miss Medsger's prose and the urgent importance, indeed the remarkable timeliness of The Burglary. Ms. Medsger's career began in 1964 at the Tribune Democrat in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. From there, she moved on to the Evening Bulletin in Philadelphia, and then on to the Washington Post, where her reporting helped make history, as you will see. And then along the way, she moved on to San Francisco State University, where she founded the Center for Integration and Improvement of Journalism. Ms. Medsger is also the author of 3 other books, including Framed, which drew on her expertise in criminal justice, and Winds of Change, the first national study of journalism education. She's also a noted photographer whose photographs, including ones from her other book, Women at Work, have been exhibited all over the world. Her photographs of Mark O'Brien, you'll remember this, were used extensively in the Academy Award-winning documentary Breathing Lessons, The Life and Work of Mark O'Brien, whose life was so memorably depicted in the feature film The Sessions. You might be surprised to know that Ms. Medsger is an occasional resident of Mystic, and some of you may even recognize her as an occasional member of our audience. You note I've said nothing about Betty Medsger's book, The Burglary, nor do I intend to, except this. The story told in the book was kept a closely guarded secret by its publisher, Knopf, until its very publication. And on the date of its publication, the New York Times ran an exclusive front-page article reporting the publication of this book. The next day, the Washington Post used the burglary as the focus for an editorial. Since then, just about every news rag and TV pundit you can think of has weighed in about the burglary. And indeed, it may soon be a major motion picture coming to your neighborhood. I don't exaggerate. This is, as I said, an urgently important book, which you're about to hear for yourself. So won't you please join me in welcoming Betty Medsger.
Thank you, Christie. I can't tell you how surprised I am to be standing here. I know what goes on here. And it's not journalism. It's lovely poetry and music like we experienced this evening from Melissa and the sea. In fact, when Christie called me and told me that he wanted me to read at the Arts Café, I was a little concerned. I thought maybe Christie was losing it. I really couldn't imagine. However, I'm grateful and I'm also humbled. Investigative journalists have been called many things, and poetic is not one of them. So I make no pretense to that, and I'm here to share some prose with you and the story of the burglary. The burglary is really the story of what by normal standards would be considered a minor, insignificant burglary. No valuables were stolen from the small office in a small building in an old suburb of Pennsylvania, Media, on that night on March 8th, 1971. As the FBI said the next morning when they confirmed the burglary, they said just a few things missing. But that wasn't quite true. Those few things led to the FBI starting one of the most intense investigations, one of the most intense manhunts and woman hunts in the history of the FBI, and eventually to much more, far more. I'll begin with a description of the beginning of the idea. In late 1970, William Davidon, a mild-mannered physics professor at Haverford College, privately asked a few people this question: what do you think of burglarizing an FBI office? Even in that time of passionate resistance against the war in Vietnam that included break-ins at draft boards, his question was startling. What besides arrest and lengthy prison sentences could result from breaking into an FBI office? The Bureau and its legendary director, J. Edgar Hoover, had been revered by Americans and considered paragons of integrity for the nearly half-century he had been director by then. Who would bear to think they could break into an FBI office? Surely the offices of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country would be as secure as Fort Knox. Just talking about the possibility seemed dangerous. With great reluctance, though, Bill Davidon had decided that burglarizing an FBI office might be the only way to confront what he considered an emergency. The likelihood that the government, through the FBI, was spying on Americans and suppressing their cherished constitutional rights to dissent. If that was true, he thought, it was a crime against democracy, a crime that must be stopped. He regarded there to be two wars at that time. In Vietnam, that war, and then also a war at home against dissent. The odds were very low that such an act of resistance could possibly succeed against the law enforcement agency headed by this man who held so much power. Nicholas Katzenbach, who, though as Attorney General was Hoover's boss, had resigned in 1966 because of Hoover's resentment over being told to manage the Bureau within the law. But the public had no idea that that was why Katzenbach had resigned. The public knew nothing about how Hoover actually operated the FBI because there was no official oversight and there was no journalistic oversight. The director's power was unique among all national officials, said Katzenbach years later. He ruled the FBI with a combination of discipline and fear and was capable of acting in an excessively arbitrary way. No one dared object. The FBI, he said, was a principality with absolute secure borders in Hoover's view. At the same time, he said, there was no man better known or more admired by the general public than J. Edgar Hoover. Such was the power and the reputation of the official whose borders and files Davidon was considering invading. He knew Hoover was very powerful, but he didn't know, nor could anyone outside the Bureau have known then, how harshly he ruled it and how he protected the Bureau from having its illegal practices exposed. If anyone else had asked that question, what do you think of burglarizing an FBI office? Of the 9 people Bill Davidon approached, probably each of them would have swiftly ended the conversation. Because it was Davidon, they took it seriously and kept listening despite being shocked. They trusted him, they knew he wasn't reckless, and they knew he believed in protest that was effective, that could lead to results. Each of them respected him so much they thought that if they ever engaged in high-risk resistance, he was one of the few people they would want to partner with as leader when the stakes were high. So they listened carefully. Only one of them, a philosophy professor, turned him down. Davidon and the 8 people who said yes in response to his question met as a group for the first time shortly before Christmas in 1970, and they chose their name, the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI. The name summed up their goal. In the absence of official oversight of this powerful law enforcement and intelligence agency, they, acting voluntarily on behalf of American citizens, would attempt to steal and make public FBI files in an effort to determine if the FBI was destroying dissent. They thought the name sounded dignified, like that of an official commission that should have been appointed years earlier by a president, an attorney general, or by Congress, committed to breaking in only if it could be done without violating their deep commitment to nonviolent resistance. They concentrated on developing the skills necessary to conduct an unarmed burglary of the office. A little bit about who these people were, in addition to Bill Davidon. Two of them were John and Bonnie Raines. John and Bonnie Raines were a young couple at that time, and they had 3 children under age 8. John was a religion professor at Temple University, and Bonnie was the director of a daycare center. And they've continued in jobs similar. He continued to be a professor, and she went on to be a major advocate for children's issue all their lives. They had made an unusual decision the previous about 10 years earlier when they were living in New York, and John was a graduate student at Union Seminary. He had been going south every summer to work in the civil rights movement at some of the toughest times. And they made a decision that they hoped that if they were ever presented with an opportunity to engage in an act of resistance that seemed as though it would undo some injustice, that they would have the courage to say yes. And so after considerable thinking and arranging for their children to be raised by other family members if they went to prison for the burglary, they said yes to Bill Davidon. And then there were 2 young people in the group, Keith and Bob, Keith Forsyth and Bob Williamson. And they were part of that small portion of the peace movement in those days who felt so strongly about ending the war in Vietnam that they dropped out of college temporarily to work full-time on trying to end the war. Bob was from a small town in New Jersey, Keith from a small town in Ohio. Keith, as soon as the commitment was made to participate, to prepare for the burglary, took a correspondence course in locksmithing. Turned out to be very useful, but not quite as useful as he had hoped. And he practiced every night in the attic of the Raines after the group went out and did casing in media. And he practiced trying to get his time down as much as possible. And then there are 2 people who are not named in the book. They have fictitious names, Ron Durst and Susan Smith. Susan Smith was a professor in the area also. And Susan Smith had been active in the civil rights movement in the South. And she had a particularly traumatic experience after the burglary when she couldn't remember whether she'd removed a glove when she was inside the FBI office. She was one of the 4 people who went in and removed the files. And the trauma of trying to remember whether or not she had removed a glove and left fingerprints was a lasting thing for years. Ron Durst was the child of Holocaust survivors, and he grew up hearing the stories night after night about the aunts and uncles that he would never know, the people who had, in his family who had not survived the Holocaust. And from that experience and those stories that he heard, never again became a very strong part of his commitment. And then as a teenager in early 20s, when he became involved in the peace movement, he felt that very strongly again, and he applied it to Cambodia and to Vietnam and to the thousands of people that he felt very strongly were dying unnecessarily. Throughout January and February, the 8 burglars cased, actually there were 9, I'll explain that later, cased the areas near the office very carefully, trying to understand the patterns of when people came and left, either for business or to go up the street to have a drink. Watched things very carefully. And then there came a time when one very important kind of casing needed to be done. About 2 weeks before the burglary, the burglars prepared for the most important casing that would be done, first-hand inspection inside the FBI office. So far, they had felt encouraged, but this casing could lead to discoveries that would force them to abandon the burglary. Casing inside an FBI office was much more difficult than casing inside a draft board office or on the streets of media. Draft board offices were open to the public. It was easy to walk in and look around. That was not the case here. Someone would have to go inside and get answers to very important questions. Were the cabinets and desks locked? Was there carpeting? What was immediately inside the other door that opened into the office from the outside hall, but always was closed when they observed it? And the biggest question, was there an alarm system in the office? The burglars agreed that Bonnie Raines would be the best person for this important job. She was 29, but with long dark hair and a bright smile, she easily looked the part of the college co-ed the other burglars suggested she pose as. Not only did the other burglars think that Bonnie looked very young, they all thought she was the member of the group most capable of looking totally innocent. When she called the office to ask for an appointment, she told Tom Lewis, the agent in charge there, that she was a student at a nearby college and doing research for a class assignment and wanted to schedule an interview with someone at the media office about FBI hiring practices. She told him she already had talked with other employers in the area, and she hoped an FBI would be able to talk to her for about a half hour. He was extremely accommodating, and he agreed to see her at 2 o'clock a few days later. It was an intimidating assignment, but Bonnie took it on with enthusiasm. She was grateful to be given this important responsibility. In the past, in nearly everything she did, she felt she had been supplemental to other people. She felt she had been treated with respect, but had not been given much responsibility. The heavier responsibility she carried as part of the media group gave her confidence that she was, as she put it years later, finally making progress in that new life she had started to create in New York when she and John Raines moved there in 1962, right after they were married. In addition to being an Earth mother, preparing those big spaghetti dinners for the group each evening before they cased media, she remembers having a feeling of great contentment, a sense that I was as much a part of the team as everyone else. As planned, Bonnie arrived about 15 minutes early. She apologized for that, telling the man seated at the reception desk right inside the open door that she had come on public transportation and that the bus had arrived earlier than she expected. Actually, John Raines had driven her to media. She was invited to sit and wait until 2 o'clock when Tom Lewis would be available to talk to her. That was just what she wanted. It meant she had time to sit quietly, survey the office slowly and carefully. As her eyes scanned the rooms, she tried to mentally photograph as much detail as possible. After several minutes, she asked the man she thought was a receptionist, but who was actually one of the agents based at the office, if she could see an employment application form. That request was consistent, of course, with her request to interview an agent about hiring practices. But the real purpose of her question about forms, though, was to observe whether he would have to unlock the file cabinet to retrieve a form for her. She was pleased that he obliged, and even more pleased that the file cabinet was not locked. It was a rather nice office, she recalled years later. It had wall-to-wall carpet. That was welcome discovery for a burglar. Carpet would help muffle burglary noises. The desks were made of wood. There was no art on the wall, unless the framed photograph of J. Edgar Hoover and President Nixon hanging in the entry room could be counted as art. In Lewis's office, there was a framed photograph of Hoover standing beside the agent. It had been autographed by Hoover. Every agent in the country had such autographed photos. There also were framed commendations from the director on the wall and photographs of Lewis's family on his desk. By the time Bonnie left the office, she had been there about an hour, longer than she had expected, and much, much longer than any of the agents in the office would admit to Bureau investigators shortly after the burglary. She thought she had accomplished her mission. Her biggest assignment was to determine if there was an alarm system. She observed that some electrical cords were covered with old cracked paint. She had tracked the cords by eye and concluded they were phone lines, and the cords of the old window air conditioners, and the cords of a couple lamps. She was confident she had traced and figured out the function of every cord. By the process of elimination, she concluded there was no alarm system. She knew the group would be excited to hear that. As she left, after returning the restroom key, the last thing she did was check again the lock on the front door, as Forsyth, the locksmith, had prepared her to. She thought his description was absolutely right. One simple lock that could be picked easily. That night was a turning point. After Bonnie Raines reported on what she had observed at the office, the other burglars felt relieved. They shared her optimism. For the first time, Davidon remembers, we knew we could do it. As the person who had proposed the burglary, he was delighted to hear her positive assessment. It was very good news. Doubts about whether the break-in could be done faded away that night for all of the burglars. Bonnie Raines had a chilling thought late that night. She kept it to herself. That night, she understood deep in her bones for the first time what one of the other burglars had said the night she agreed to case inside. At the time, she had not fully absorbed the meaning of the comment. Now she did. As of her visit to the office today, FBI agents had a specific person to whom they later would tie the burglary, her. The night after she visited the office, she couldn't help smiling, though, to herself, as she thought about the deception she had pulled off. She enjoyed the irony then and years later. Her Michigan State cheerleader good looks and Earth Mother qualities had turned out to be useful to the group. She had been able to use her all-American girl-next-door looks, still intact at 29, to move the burglary forward. March 8, 1979, was chosen for a very special reason as the night of the burglary. That was the night that Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier were going to have their first heavyweight championship match at Madison Square Garden. It was a very exciting time in the sports world and beyond. It was the first time that Muhammad Ali would return to the ring after 6 years of being out because he had been convicted for refusing to serve in the military. I called the chapter about the day of the burglary, the night of the burglary, with thanks to Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. Normal moments can seem so wonderful. It is very painful, though, to think that normal moments may be about to end, especially when you know that you yourself may be about to cause them to end. That's how John Raines felt as he looked at the children at dinner on the night of the burglary. They were beautiful. Their chatter was beautiful. It was more than cute. It was downright precious. Such a wonderful, normal thing it was to be sitting there at the dinner table with Bonnie and their 3 children. It was the kind of experience he took for granted every day. Over the 9 years of their marriage, they had created a wonderful life together. They felt deep love and respect for each other. Their life seemed ideal, especially now. It was rich with shared passion, shared values, and shared daily joys. He found it impossible to imagine a better life. Never again, he thought, would he take it for granted. As they drove to the motel that Davidon had rented in his own name, about 2 miles from Media, as a staging area. As they drove to the motel, not talking much, John Raines' stomach was churning. He silently and urgently asked himself, why are we doing this? He knew the answer, and it was one he completely embraced. Still, as the time of the burglary grew closer, it was painful for him to live out the commitment he had made to Bonnie and the other burglars. He was sure, no matter how tonight turned out, that people would think it was an utterly wild idea. They would wonder how these burglars ever were able to think they could possibly get away with it. Right now, on the road to the burglary, he wondered the same thing. He had taken serious risks before, even life-threatening ones. He remembered the night he spent alone in a cell in a dark jail in a small town in southwestern Georgia during one of the summers when he went to the South to join black people in the struggle for their basic rights. Black leaders had discovered that John was in danger. In an act of great generosity and solidarity, a local black farmer had put up his small farm as bail to get John out of jail, perhaps saving his life. Tonight was far more difficult for John to face than even that night in Georgia that he spent in jail. He didn't think their lives would be endangered tonight, but he did think their entire future would be. He had never felt as frightened as he did tonight on the way to media. Davidon remembers feeling calmness mixed with both fear and the pumping drive of adrenaline as the burglars gathered at the motel room. Others described the atmosphere similarly, a combination of controlled excitement and fear. All agree that everyone was sober and serious. After weeks of planning together, they had confidence in one another. Each of them was aware that he or she held the future of everyone in the group in their hands. A mistake made by one could be disastrous to all. Bonds of trust seemed to be strong. They had no idea that night what, if anything, Jonathan Flaherty, the person who had abandoned the group just a few days earlier, would do, or for all they knew, already had done, with the comprehensive and potentially devastating information he possessed. The burglary moved into the first stage of the burglary, though, as though no one except the 8 of them knew anything about the plans. And then about what was happening in New York. I don't think there's ever been a night like it, John Congdon, the director of publicity at Madison Square Garden at the time, recalled years later. Everyone was standing or sitting on the edge of their seats from the time they arrived and throughout the fight. They screamed, they yelled, they gasped. That was exactly what the media burglars hoped for. An event in New York so engrossing, a crowd so loud and excited that the steady static from the fight would help them go about their work inside the FBI office without being noticed. They hoped fans, especially fight fans in media, including police and FBI agents, would be glued to their radios and televisions that night. Not to mention the people who lived in the apartments on the 2 floors above the FBI office and the manager of the building who lived in the apartment right below the FBI office. In media, in contrast with the wild scene in New York, what the burglars hoped would be their decoy, the difference could not have been greater. The initial steps of the burglary were the sounds of silence. Keith Forsyth arrived in just a few minutes and parked a short distance from the building where the FBI office was located. This was a big moment for him. He had been preparing for it with a great deal of dedication. He still felt sure he would pick that lock and be inside the office in 30 seconds flat, his best speed during lockpicking practice. As he left the car, he carried a briefcase. In it were his homemade lockpicking tools. The smaller tools were in a pencil case tucked in a small inside pocket of his overcoat. His larger tools were covered by a few layers of paper, so the paper, not the tools, would be seen first if the briefcase opened in front of anyone. He had been meticulous in his preparations. Each of the metal lockpicking tools he had wrapped in foam rubber so they wouldn't clank against each other as he walked. The briefcase looked appropriate for someone wearing a Brooks Brothers suit that he had purchased for $5 at a mainline used clothing store. That was so important, he says. You can do anything you want in the United States if you wear a suit and tie, especially if you're white. That also helps. And the briefcase, of course, added added to his all-American, busy businessman coming home late from work. He wore leather gloves, appropriate for a businessman. Underneath them, he wore tight-fitting rubber gloves. The leather gloves would hamper his dexterity, so essential to his task tonight. So he planned to remove them and put them in his coat pockets and wear only the rubber gloves so he could pick the lock with the dexterity of a surgeon. Acting as though he lived in the building, Forsyth opened the always unlocked, well-lit front door, walked upstairs to the second floor, and went directly to the FBI office door. He felt slightly nervous, but very confident. His confidence quickly evaporated. He could not pick the lock in 30 seconds. He could not pick the lock at all. As he faced the object of his many rounds of lock-picking practice, Forsyth was startled. There were 2 locks, not one, on the main entrance of the FBI office. One was the simple 5-tumbler lock that he remembered seeing and was prepared to pick, the same one Bonnie Raines remembered. But now there was a second lock, a much more complex one, a high-security lock that was extremely difficult to pick. Forsyth tried using his homemade tools on it. They were useless. I freaked out. First of all, I can't get in. Second of all, what does this mean? What's the probability of this lock appearing by purely random chance just at the moment when I'm about to break through the door? It's astronomically small. I'm thinking, wait a minute. They put this lock on there? What does that mean? They know? How the hell do they know? He left the building. He found a payphone. He called the motel and asked for Bill Davidon and said, I think we have to call it off. And Davidon said, come back to the motel, and we'll all talk about it together. From the time Forsyth returned to the motel until a decision was made, the intense discussion of alternatives lasted not more than 15 minutes. Bonnie Raines recalls that it was an extremely tense moment. After Forsyth described his failure to pick the lock and worried aloud about the long time plus noise it probably would take to pry the other door open, burglars responded with a few questions and much empathy. Bonnie Raines answered his questions about the second door. She had told him after she visited the FBI office that that door must not be entered, that there was a very large cabinet that was packed with paper. It would make a terrible sound if it fell to the floor. When there seemed to be no more questions, Davidon summed up what they did and did not know. Then he said something like, we've gone this far. There is no evidence we've aroused any suspicion. Everything else seems to be okay. He didn't think the doubt about whether the lock had been added should stop them. There were no other signs, he said, that they were being watched. Very calmly, but also urgently, he said they needed to make a decision very quickly. When he stopped speaking, the burglars searched one another's faces. There was total silence. Bonnie Raines remembers realizing that a consensus had been reached. Suddenly, she said, heads began nodding affirmatively. Everyone agreed to go ahead. I don't know what would have happened if 1 or 2 people had just said, forget it, I'm out of here. But that didn't happen. Instead, everyone agreed to begin again. Whatever their risk originally, they realized the decision they had just made might have exponentially increased it. At 10:30 in New York, the ring announcer calmed the crowd enough to introduce great boxers from the past, all of whom came into the ring. There was a huge ovation when Joe Louis climbed into the ring. By that time, the excitement in New York was extreme. As it built, the sports writer Dave Kendrick wrote 30 years later, such a night had never been seen in the history of sports. I don't remember breathing all night. What international tennis champion Arthur Ashe later described as the biggest event in the history of boxing was about to begin. No fight ever transcended boxing, he later wrote, as that one did throughout the world. At 10:40, the bell rang and the fight started. Forsyth arrived at the FBI office about that time. The 30-second break-in plan, now long gone, breaking in now seemed like it would be more like a small demolition job than a swift lock-picking exercise. Soon Muhammad Ali felt the same. Of course, Forsyth had no idea that the fight schedule and his revised break-in schedule might mesh as they did, let alone whether it would matter. The fight was not on his mind. Again, he entered the building, briefcase in hand, trying again to look as though he either lived there or was on his way to see a client, though it was a little late for that. Given the crude and slow way the break-in would now have to be done, the odds of residents walking by or hearing the sound of wood breaking had increased. This time, in addition to his set of delicate homemade tools in his briefcase, he also carried a crowbar hidden in his topcoat. There, in the well-lit second-floor hall, where residents might pass by at any time, Forsyth stretched his more than 6-foot frame down on the floor and proceeded to use his leg muscles to push and pull the bar. As he rocked the bar, he feared a resident from upstairs apartment might at any moment decide to go for a walk or a drink and come down the stairs, nearly stepping on his face as he lay stretched out on the floor near the stairs, huffing and puffing as he pushed on the FBI door. There he was, a man on the floor in a topcoat, making a fulcrum of himself. "Hello, good evening," he imagined himself wryly and politely saying as he looked up from the floor into the face of a very puzzled resident and did his best to act as though their bizarre encounter was natural and should not be reported to police. While Forsyth was working hard on the floor, he heard this clank noise from inside the office. My heart dropped to my heels. Have you ever had that sinking feeling like you're just about to get struck from behind by a speeding semi-trailer or something like that? I thought, here I go down the tubes, and there's nothing I can do about it. I'm thinking to myself, was that a clumsy FBI agent, or was that the heating system? And I'm thinking, what did it really sound like? It sounded metallic. It sounded like the sound of two pieces of metal hitting each other. Still pushing and pulling, he was thinking as he was earlier. Well, if the lock was changed because the FBI knows about the burglary, agents might be standing in the darkened office with guns drawn, waiting for me to step inside. Unlike his humorous musings about what he would say if a resident walked by, he had no musings about what he would say if he encountered agents with drawn guns on the other side of the door. Hello, good evening seemed unlikely. Finally, I said to myself, there's only one way to find out. I'm paranoid at this moment. I probably exaggerated the sound, so I say to myself, let's just go for it. Let's open the door and say, surprise. His sense of humor may not have been quite that brash at that moment, but he did force himself to push through his fear. There was a little moment of panic there, he recalls. Forsyth has one pleasant memory from the minutes when he was stretched out on the floor. While he was on his back pushing and shoving the door ever so carefully and repeatedly, he heard the crackling noise of the Ali-Frazier fight broadcast in apartments above. At a time when a smile didn't seem possible, he smiled. Ali and Frazier were helping, as the burglars had hoped they would. Then finally, success. Success for Forsyth, breaking in, finding no FBI agents inside with drawn guns, and success also for the 4 burglars who would arrive moments later, remove in the dark, remove every file in the office and carry them out in the 2 big suitcases that each of them had, and do so in front of a guard who stood in front of the county courthouse across the street. A guard stood there 24 hours a day, and they knew there was no way to avoid being seen by him. He did tell agents he saw nothing when he was interviewed repeatedly about what happened that night. The burglars drove from Media that night in getaway cars to a farmhouse about 30 miles away from, it was on a Quaker conference grounds. And the discovery the next morning had a huge impact, as you can imagine, in the FBI office and at FBI headquarters. One of Hoover's favorite reporters described him as being apoplectic. He immediately called the investigation. Medsger paid attention to every detail himself and assigned 200 agents from all over the country to begin the investigation. It went on for 5 years. The first step was to take those thousands of photographs that agents and informers had taken at anti-war rallies all over the country during the Vietnam War years. Search through them for people who might look, whatever that meant, like people who would burglarize an FBI office. Mostly it meant long hair and beards. There were thousands of those people in the immediate area alone. Meanwhile, at the farm, the burglars spent 10 days reading, sorting, collating the 1,000 files that they had stolen. They went away from the farm and actually they went to work every day at their day jobs, returned at night and did these things. And then they also went away and copied the files and prepared packets that they would send out over a period of the next 2 months. So on the last day that they were together at the farm, they made 2 promises to each other. The first one, that they would take the secret of the burglary to their graves, that they would tell no one about it. And the other promise that they would not associate with each other again, that they were afraid that the arrest of one could lead to the arrest of another if they associated with each other. And the next day, John Raines traveled to Princeton and mailed the first set of files to 5 people, thereby setting in motion, with the Princeton postmark, an intense investigation of all people with long hair in Princeton. That meant that just a few days later, and what was 2 weeks after the burglary, the files that he mailed arrived in Washington. The recipients were 2 members of Congress, Senator George McGovern and Parren Mitchell, a member of Congress from Baltimore, and 3 journalists, Tom Wicker, a columnist at the New York Times Washington Bureau, Jack Nelson, an investigative reporter at the Los Angeles Times of the Washington Bureau, and me, a reporter at the Washington Post. I didn't know until until I read the 34,000-page investigative file of the burglary that the FBI had done of the burglary, that I was the only recipient who did not return the files to the FBI. If I had known that, I don't know what meaning it would have had. Other newspapers, the New York Times and the LA Times, did not write stories until after we did. And after we did, then everybody else did. It was a surprise, of course, to receive stolen FBI files. Some stood out immediately as shocking, I think, is the only word for it. The first file underneath a form letter that I received from the Citizens Commission described an instruction to agents that they were to enhance paranoia and that they were to make people think that an FBI agent was behind every mailbox. I thought it so strange that such a policy would be reduced to writing and placed in a file, in an intelligence agency. And I thought that maybe that indicated that this was a hoax that I held in my hand. But as I read, because I had been in Philadelphia as a reporter, I saw familiar names. I realized it probably wasn't a hoax. And I read about the spying on local campuses that had involved hiring switchboard operators, postal carriers, and mid-level administrators to spy on professors and students. But probably the most important of those files in the end were quite a few files that described what constituted blanket surveillance of African Americans. There were details about this surveillance in Philadelphia, but it was the description of a program that then existed throughout the country. And it described a kind of surveillance that didn't involve going after people who were violent or were suspected of crimes, but just being black was enough in Hoover's eyes for you to come under the blanket surveillance of the FBI. Every agent, this was in the files, every agent was required to hire an informer who would report to him regularly on the activities of black people, except in Washington, D.C., where every agent was required to have 6 informers who reported to him regularly on the activities of black people. My primary question, as I finished reading that first of what would be several sets I received over the next few months, my primary question was whether they were authentic. And that turned out to be easy to answer because the FBI was eager to tell us that they were authentic. They were copies of files stolen from their media office because they thought that would convince us that the stories should not be written. All afternoon, as I was writing the story and calling people in Philadelphia and asking questions, the Attorney General, some of you have white hair and will remember that his name was John Mitchell. All afternoon, the Attorney General was calling alternately to 2 editors of the paper who were in charge of the story and the publisher, Catherine Graham. And he insisted that the files that we possessed would endanger national security and endanger lives if we published them. Very serious claims. Fortunately, it was possible from reading the files to know that that was not possible. I mean, what we held in our hands was something that would embarrass the FBI tremendously, but would inform the public about some pretty important information we thought they needed to know. The Attorney General, by late afternoon, put out a notice to the wire services asking them to post it verbatim nationally, saying anyone possessing these files should return them to the Bureau and do not publish them. At 6 o'clock, I finished my story and handed it in and learned that it probably would not be published. It's important to know that the decision was difficult for Catherine Graham, primarily, I think, because of 2 things. First, this was the first time that a journalist had ever been given secret government files by someone from outside the government who had stolen the files. The other thing that's important to know is that this was the first time that the Nixon administration had demanded that Catherine Graham suppress a story because they didn't like it. She had a lot of practice later in this, as you may recall, beginning 3 months later when the Post received the Pentagon Papers, and then a month later when something named Watergate came along. By 10 o'clock that evening, she changed her mind and said yes. And the story was on the front page above the fold the next day in the Post and across the country in papers that received the Post wire. There was an immediate outcry for an investigation of the FBI, including by some senators and editorial writers across the country who had before never said anything but praise for J. Edgar Hoover. And interestingly, that the movement toward an investigation was slowed down and really stopped at that time by Senator Sam Ervin, who would become a hero in the following years for his investigation of Watergate. At that time, he said he thought Mr. Hoover was doing a fine job and there was no need for an investigation. But there were a number of things that happened that did lead to an investigation. And the most important one was an action taken by NBC reporter Carl Stern. A little more than a year after the burglary, Carl saw one of the files. It was a cover letter that I received in the first set of files. It was a routing slip, and at the top of it was the term COINTELPRO. And it was on the top of a file that I did write a story about. But the connection between that file that I wrote about and that term wasn't obvious, and so I had not mentioned the term. But Carl, when he saw that years later at the Senate Judiciary Office, he wondered what in the world that term meant. And so we found out later that on the day I wrote the story, the FBI had been watching to see whether the file with that routing slip ever was written about. And when it was, they knew that for the first time, that very important term that described some operations that they hoped would be secret forever, they knew that term was outside the FBI for the first time. And by 2 weeks later, Hoover had written to all offices in the country and said, we'll keep the operations going, but they'll no longer have that name. So that when people call, as they did later, and they ask what is COINTELPRO, we say there is no such program. Some operations carried out by the secret FBI were crude. Others were cruel and life-threatening. Anti-war activist oranges were injected with powerful laxatives. Agents hired prostitutes known to have venereal disease to infect campus anti-war leaders. Prostitutes were hired in an effort to entrap leaders of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Some plots were designed to destroy specific individuals and institutions. Some of the plots would have been considered beyond the bounds of humane conduct if carried out by any agency or individual. But they were regarded as even worse, nearly beyond belief, when it was discovered they were operations that had been executed by the nation's most powerful law enforcement agency, and that it did so under the leadership of a director who repeatedly spoke within the agency and to the public about the need for strict moral behavior. The media break-in changed the whole dynamic, says historian Ethan Theo-Harris. Then, when COINTELPRO was revealed, that finally exceeded what the public would support. These secret FBI operations, COINTELPRO and others, utilized the tools of espionage, tools usually reserved for clandestine use against foreign enemies, were employed under Hoover against a wide swath of Americans in efforts to stop dissent. The methods used by the FBI inflicted pain, anxiety, and humiliation, forms of torture. The operations were, in the words of respected surveillance scholar Frank Donner, an embryonic version of officially instigated terrorism. Among all of the political operations conducted by the Bureau, surely the most egregious was the one conducted against the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Hoover's attitude toward King can be described as a nearly savage hatred. Probably most of you remember or have heard about the plan to try to convince Martin Luther King to commit suicide in the days before he received the Nobel Peace Prize. Hoover's tendency to be particularly cruel to African Americans was also evident in the planting of false rumors that set off violent confrontations between black organizations. It was evident in the seemingly casual, callous attitude towards setting up the murder of one black man, Fred Hampton, and allowing another black man, Geronimo Pratt, to be falsely convicted for murder. Chicago Black Panther leader Hampton was shot dead in his sleep in his apartment by Chicago police after a diagram of his apartment, including where he slept, was given to the police by an FBI informant with a spot on the diagram marked Fred's bed. In internal documents, the FBI took credit for the killing. The information the informer provided, wrote an agent, was considered to be of tremendous value to the success of the raid, they wrote. After the raid that resulted in the killing of Hampton and Mark Clark, a member of the Panthers Peoria chapter, the FBI installed wiretaps on the phones of the survivors of the raid so agents could listen to them talk with their lawyers. The Bureau gave the FBI informer who provided the floor plan a bonus. Pratt, a much decorated Vietnam veteran and Black Panther leader in Los Angeles, spent 27 years in prison for a murder conviction that was overturned in 1977 by an Orange County judge who ruled that evidence that likely would have led to Pratt's acquittal was concealed by the FBI at his trial. He was convicted on the basis of testimony of an FBI informer who lied at the trial. The dirty tricks, which seems like a much too gentle way to describe them, were quite varied and involved many different kinds of people, sometimes for very mild things. Jean Seberg, the actress, for example, had given a contribution to a black organization in Los Angeles. Someone in Los Angeles office got the idea for a COINTELPRO operation that would involve planting the false rumor that the child that she was carrying was the child of a Black Panther. Hoover personally approved the operation and advised him to wait until she was much more visibly pregnant so there would be no question who the rumor was about when the columnist would write that an actress, a rather famous actress, was carrying a Black Panther's child. When her white baby was born dead, Jean Seberg went into a Great Depression, and a few years later, on the anniversary of the birth of that child, she committed suicide. Those revelations, plus what people felt after Watergate, led to a spirit of reform by the mid-1970s, and Congress couldn't stand still anymore. And in early 1975, both houses of Congress conducted the first oversight investigations of the FBI and all intelligence agencies. And those investigations gave the public to hear under oath testimony from FBI officials about what had taken place during those years. And then they led to major reforms that included the establishment of permanent oversight, intelligence oversight committees in Congress, and also a law that said that an FBI director could never serve for more than 10 years, not for a half century ever again. The burglars were never caught. After 5 years, the FBI, the statute of limitations had ended, although the burglars didn't know that. For all they knew, they were still under investigation. They were never caught, and they kept their secret. They never told anyone about what they had done until one evening, many years later, many years after the burglary, and even many years after the impact of their burglary had been accomplished. I discovered them quite accidentally. It happened over dinner one evening at the home of Bonnie and John Raines. Between meetings in Missouri and Massachusetts, I lived in California at the time, I gave myself the gift of a long weekend in Philadelphia. It was the first time I'd been to Philadelphia in many years. I filled the weekend visiting people I had known when I was a reporter at the Evening Bulletin in the late 1960s. I spent the first evening with the Rainses. And though we were not close friends when I lived in Philadelphia, they were people I liked and respected and looked forward to seeing again. When I arrived that evening, the three of us immediately launched into telling one another about the last decade of our lives. During dinner, their youngest child, Mary, then a teenager, joined us for a few minutes. John Raines introduced me to her with words that startled me. "Mary, this is Betty Medsger. We want you to know Betty, because many years ago, when your dad and mother had information about the FBI, we wanted the American people to know. We gave it to Betty." I wish they were here to hear you. I was stunned. I still am sometimes. I could tell from Mary's pleasant but unmoved expression that the comment meant nothing to her. As she talked with her parents, my mind was racing. Maybe I misunderstood. How could John and Bonnie Raines, this lovely suburban couple with 4 children, a station wagon, formerly a getaway car, I found out later, and a big friendly black dog named Jess, possibly have carried out a burglary, especially that burglary? I wanted to shout questions, but I restrained myself. Nice as Mary obviously was, I could hardly wait until she left the dining room. After she did, with quite a bit of incredulity, I said, "Are you saying you were the media burglars?" With wide, glowing smiles, Bonnie and John said they were. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. And later, they said they did not plan to tell me their secret that night. John just happened to blurt it out to Mary. He still says it was an accident. Needless to say, I am enormously grateful for that accidental comment. Thank you.